The winter sky over Manchuria looked like a sheet of hammered steel, heavy and bruised, pressing down on the jagged mountain ridges. It was early December 1944, and the cold had its own personality, sharp, invasive, determined to slip through seams, boots, thoughts, even memories. Snow drifted sideways across narrow passes, carried by a wind that whistled like something wounded. Beneath that brutal sky moved a Japanese platoon that had long stopped looking like soldiers. Their uniforms were crusted with ice, their steps uneven, their breaths shallow and fast. Every sound, cloth creaking, boots cracking the frost, felt amplified in the emptiness. Among them walked Haruto. He carried no rank, no voice in the command tent. Only a small pack filled with spare bandages, canteens, and the quiet tools of his trade. Twine, a bone needle, a small carving knife that had belonged to his father. At 16, he looked even younger in the oversized winter coat that swallowed his thin frame. But his eyes, dark, patient, watchful, were older than most men in the platoon. They scanned the snow, the rock walls, the distant fog pockets, always searching for meaning in what others saw as randomness. The officers barely noticed him. To them, he was another auxiliary, a mountain boy drafted through circumstance, useful for carrying supplies but unfit for strategic thought. They barked orders without looking at him, expected obedience without question, and assumed that silence meant submission. Haruto let them believe it. Speaking had never brought him much in life anyway. The mountains taught him to read, without words. As the platoon trudged across a narrow plateau, Haruto felt the cold bite his cheeks, but inside he carried a different chill, the memory of the avalanche that had taken his father. Years had passed, but the image returned often. The slope trembling under an unnatural weight, the faint crack that had heard but dismissed, the sudden roar that swallowed everything. He had been the only one close enough to notice the warning signs, and yet too inexperienced to understand them. The guilt had fused with him, hard as ice, shaping his silence. Colonel Ishida, a rigid man whose voice cut through the wind with the clarity of a blade, signaled for a halt. He pointed toward the far side of the plateau, where a narrow descent began. "We pushed through before dusk," he said. Soviet scouts were spotted 2 ridges north. Speed is more important than caution. The men nodded stiffly. Caution was always secondary these days. Food was low, morale lower, and every day brought rumors of Soviet patrols tightening the noose around the region. Orders came from command outposts that no longer had reliable maps, their officers making decisions based on faith rather than terrain. Haruto had seen the truth of it many times. The mountains didn't care about human confidence. They rewarded only those who understood their signals. When the platoon resumed movement, Haruto drifted slightly away from the column, letting his eyes trace the snow's surface. Something felt wrong. The wind carried a faint vibration, soft, rhythmic, not from nature. Then he saw it, a line of nearly invisible micro-fissures cutting diagonally across the slope ahead. No one else would notice them. They were too thin, too shallow, too deliberately placed. The kind of disruption made not by the weather, but by boots that tried to tread lightly. Soviet boots. Haruto paused, kneeling. He ran his fingertips near the fissures, close enough to sense but not disturb them. The snow was freshly packed, but not by wind. A twig nearby held a single fiber cloth, blue-gray, coarse, nothing Japanese. Soviet winter coats shed threads like that in rough movement. Haruto's stomach tightened. The platoon was walking into a path recently crossed by enemy scouts. Maybe an hour earlier. Maybe less. He looked up at Colonel Ishida. The officer stood rigid, scanning the far ridge through binoculars, seeing nothing. Haruto knew what would happen if he spoke. The colonel would dismiss him, or worse, reprimand him for questioning the chosen route. The chain of command was more delicate than ice. One wrong word could crack it. But if he stayed silent, he closed his eyes. His father's voice, remembered not through sound but through the way he used to point at tracks in the dirt, rose in his mind. You read the mountain or the mountain reads you. Haruto exhaled slowly. His breath formed a brief mist that dissolved into the wind. He stepped forward, touching the sleeve of Sergeant Watanabe, one of the few men who treated him like a person. Watanabe turned frowning, but Haruto kept his voice low. almost swallowed by the wind. Tracks ahead. Not ours. Watanabe's eyes widened. He looked at Haruto's expression, saw no doubt there. How many? 3, maybe 4. Moving fast. The sergeant hesitated only a moment before signaling quietly to Ishida. But the colonel was already impatient. What is it now? Watanabe explained in a clipped whisper. Ishida lowered his binoculars, staring at Haruto with visible irritation. You, he said, our baggage carrier, not a tracker. We follow the designated route. Haruto felt the familiar sting of dismissal. But before the colonel could turn away, the wind shifted. It carried a faint metallic tang, oil, warm metal, human sweat, signs Haruto knew too well. Soviet rifles recently handled. Then the sound came, the soft click of a bolt sliding into place somewhere in the fog. Haruto didn't think. He moved. Down, he shouted, a rare, sharp cry escaping him like a burst of instinct. The first shot cracked through the air an instant later. Snow exploded around the platoon as hidden Soviet scouts opened fire. Men dove behind scattered rocks, scrambling, cursing, grabbing rifles that were half frozen. The officers shouted contradictory orders, their formation collapsing in seconds. Ishida stared at Haruto with startled disbelief, but the boy had no time to acknowledge it. He already felt the mountains speaking to him again, warning him, guiding him, just as it failed to do on the day his father died. This time he would not fail. Gunfire cracked to the frozen air like rapid splinters of glass. Echoes bounced between the cliffs, multiplying the sound until it felt like the mountains themselves were firing back. Men scrambled for cover behind boulders glazed with ice, sliding, cursing, their breath turning into frantic clouds. The Soviet scouts had chosen their position well. Hidden behind a curtain of fog and elevation, they could strike down with precision while remaining nearly invisible. Panic spread quickly, not because the soldiers were untrained, but because they had been walking half asleep for days, their senses numbed by cold and exhaustion. Haruto pressed himself against the ground, feeling the sting of snow on his cheek. He didn't panic. His mind shifted into the same quiet state he felt when tracking wild goats with his father, an awareness not based on sight alone, but on vibration, smell, shifts of air. The Soviets were not many. He could sense in the rhythm of the shots, the spacing between muzzle flashes barely visible through the fog. 4, maybe 5, enough to scatter them, but not enough to wipe out the platoon. The threat was real, yet manageable if they listened. Most wouldn't. Colonel Ishida shouted commands that dissolved in the chaos. Return fire. Advance to the ridge. Spread out. But his words clashed with the terrain. Advancing toward the ridge meant moving upward through exposed snow. Suicidal. A few soldiers obeyed anyway, trusting hierarchy more than instinct, and immediately found themselves under targeted fire. One fell, rolling down the slope with a startled grunt, leaving a thin red trail on the snow. Sergeant Watanabe, crouched beside Haruto, breathed fast but kept his hand steady on his rifle. Where are they exactly? He asked, voice tight but controlled. Haruto pointed without hesitation. There, and higher, 2 behind that broken pine, another near the ridge edge. He didn't explain how he knew, how the snow carried vibrations, how the wind shifted differently when passing around a human body, how the faint scent of oil always drifted downhill. Watanabe didn't ask. He had seen enough from the boy in recent weeks to trust him, even if command did not. Watanabe signaled silently to a small cluster of infantry nearby. They were men who had grown tired of Ishida's certainty and had come to rely more on what they saw than what they were told. Cover fire, Watanabe murmured. Short bursts. Don't waste bullets. As the rifles barked back toward the fog, Haruto slid across the snow with fluid, almost animal-like movements. He sought the thin line where the slope curved downward, providing a natural shield. Bullets hissed over his head, some close enough to pluck pieces of ice from the ground. His heart pounded, but his mind stayed sharp. He paused near a small outcrop, scanning the battlefield. The Soviets were adjusting their fire pattern. That meant they had noticed the counterattack. Their shots became more controlled, shifting slightly to the left, toward the cluster of Japanese infantry, trying to reposition. Haruto knew the Soviets' next move. They would try to flank. He saw the faint disturbance in the fog to the right, a slow ripple of movement. One scout was breaking away to find a new angle. If he warned Ishida, the colonel would either ignore him or send a loud command that would expose them all. Haruto didn't shout. He acted, sliding low. He circled around a boulder and climbed a short, icy rise using his hands. The cold bit through his gloves, but he ignored it. Reaching the crest, he flattened himself behind a fallen log. From there, he saw the Soviet scout emerge from the fog, a tall man with a fur-lined hat, rifle raised, eyes scanning for an angle. He moved cautiously, seasoned, disciplined. Haruto watched him for a heartbeat, then another. He wasn't a fighter by training. He wasn't even supposed to hold a rifle, according to regulations. But he understood survival, and he understood the consequences of hesitation. A memory of his father's face flickered, the warmth of a hand on his shoulder, the steady voice saying, "A mountain boy must act before the danger grows." Haruto steadied his breathing. The Soviet scout drew closer, boots crunching softly. Haruto lunged. He moved fast, grabbing the man's coat and pulling him off balance before the rifle could swing his way. The scout crashed into the snow, surprised, but he reacted quickly, reaching for a knife at his belt. Haruto blocked the arm with his forearm and pressed his weight down, struggling against a larger man. The soldier snarled something in Russian, trying to throw him off. For Haruto, the world reduced to sensations. The sharp smell of iron, the rough fabric of the coat, the heat rising from their bodies in the cold air. The struggle lasted only seconds. Haruto grabbed a rock half buried in the snow and struck the scout's temple. The man went limp instantly, falling sideways with a soft thud. Haruto stared at him, breath trembling. He did not feel triumph, only necessity. Below, the firing slowed. Watanabe's group had pinned the remaining Soviets long enough to force them into retreat. Their silhouettes pulled back into the fog, leaving the mountains silent again except for the wind's mournful howl. One by one, the Japanese soldiers lifted their heads, cautious, uncertain. Ishida exhaled with visible relief and tried to reclaim authority. "Cease fire. Regroup." Haruto descended the slope quietly. Watanabe met him halfway, eyes widening when he saw the unconscious scout left behind. "You did that?" he asked. Haruto nodded once. He didn't explain how close he had come to losing control or how his hands still shook. Before Watanabe could say more, Ishida approached, his expression hard but confused. "Did you attack one of them alone?" he demanded. Haruto kept his gaze lowered. He was moving to flank. Watanabe added, "Sir, if not for him, we might have lost 3 or 4 men." Ishida opened his mouth, then hesitated, a rare crack in his rigid certainty. But instead of acknowledging Haruto, he simply said, "We continue forward. We cannot afford delays." The conversation ended, buried by the colonel's pride. Night fell within an hour, swallowing the ridge in blue darkness. The platoon huddled behind a cluster of rocks, lighting no fires, speaking in low tones. The cold dug deeper into bones now, stealing warmth even from the strongest men. Hunger gnawed at everyone. Some soldiers whispered curses toward the command. Others whispered prayers. Haruto sat alone near the ridge wall, arms wrapped around his knees. His body ached from the fight. His knuckles were bruised, his lungs still burning from cold air and fear. Yet what troubled him most was not the battle. It was the silence that followed. The silence of men who had seen what he could do and didn't know what to make of it. The silence of an officer unwilling to see value in someone outside the traditional chain of command. But the mountain didn't care about hierarchy, and neither did the enemy. Haruto closed his eyes, listening to the distant groans of shifting ice across the cliffs. The mountain was speaking again, in warnings too subtle for most ears. Something bigger was coming, something that would not be stopped with quick reflexes or bursts of rifle fire. And Haruto knew that, whether they realized it or not, the platoon would soon rely on him again. The cold deepened overnight, settling across the Manchurian mountains with the weight of an iron shroud. Dawn arrived reluctantly, unable to pierce the fog that clung to the valley and ridge lines. The light that did manage to break through seemed thin and exhausted, as if the sun itself were weakened by the winter. Frost coated every surface. Stones, equipment, sleeves, even the stubble on the faces of men who had slept in fits of misery. When the platoon began to stir, the sound was small and fragile. Quiet coughs, muted groans, boots scraping the snow to restore circulation. They were soldiers in uniform only, in posture, in eyes, in breath. They resembled men from whom warmth and certainty had long been stolen. Haruto had risen before most of them, roused not by any sergeant's order, but by the subtle language of the mountain, the faint shift of snow nearby, the whisper of wind changing direction, the instinctive awareness of terrain that his father had taught him in childhood. The ridge ahead was harsh and narrow. Beyond it, a valley Ishida, intended for platoon to cross by midday. Haruto had studied that valley the previous night from a vantage point beside a tall boulder, and even then something had unsettled him. Valleys were supposed to funnel sound, but this one had absorbed everything. No echo, no wind whistle, no distant crack of ice. Just silence, as if the mountain were holding its breath. He approached the ridge edge again and crouched, eyes scanning the valley with slow, deliberate focus. Snowdrifts created smooth mounds across the flat ground, and the fog wove itself between isolated pines. At first glance, it appeared untouched, but as Haruto narrowed his gaze, small inconsistencies broke through. Shallow lines in the snow that did not follow the direction of the wind, slight depressions over broad patches where weight had been distributed, broken branches dusted with suspiciously even layers of snow, impressions shaped like boxes half buried beneath a thin crust. These were not natural signs. They were marks of men trying to hide their presence. Haruto felt a pulse of dread. Someone, likely Soviet scouts, had crossed the valley recently and tried to conceal their tracks. The rectangular impressions were unmistakable. Ammo crates or supply boxes, dragged across the snow and then covered. And judging by the freshness of the snow layer over them, the activity had not occurred long ago. When Haruto returned to the platoon, Watanabe immediately sensed that something had unsettled him. The sergeant's gaze sharpened as Haruto explained what he'd seen, but their quiet exchange drew Ishida's attention. The colonel, stiff and brittle under the weight of his own certainty, approached with impatience already drawn into the lines of his face. Haruto spoke plainly, without drama. There were signs of Soviet presence ahead, signs deliberately masked. Ishida dismissed him instantly. To the colonel, terrain was navigated by map and compass alone, not instinct or superstition, as he liked to call the mountain boy's observations. Watanabe tried to mediate, suggesting at least a cautious scouting before committing the platoon to the valley, but Ishida refused. His voice carried the strained authority of a man who could not afford to appear uncertain before his subordinates. They would cross the valley, he insisted, because the map dictated it, and because any hesitation would concede initiative to the enemy. The descent into the valley was quiet, almost eerily so. The men marched with their heads tucked low, their breaths forming brief clouds that vanished into the cold. The snow muffled each step, creating an illusion of peace that made Haruto even more tense. The silence was wrong. Valleys like this should have had natural disturbances, wind currents, falling frost from overhead branches, distant echoes. But everything felt suspended. Haruto walked to the rear, his senses stretched thin, scanning every detail. The uneven layering of snow in certain spots, the faint metallic scent riding the wind, the subtle vibration beneath the ground that felt like compacted earth disturbed by shovels. Then he saw the danger. They were approaching a section of the valley floor where the snow's surface looked uniformly smooth but lacked depth. Haruto recognized it instantly, the way the snow sagged slightly under Ishida's steps. Not enough collapse, but far too soft to be natural. It wasn't a solid patch of land. It was a cover. The Soviets had dug something beneath it, a trench, a foxhole, a concealed pit. Perhaps they had intended an ambush. Soldiers falling in, becoming disorganized, vulnerable, easy targets. Haruto's stomach tightened. Ishida stepped forward again, and Haruto knew the next step would send him plunging to the false floor. The boy ran. His boots slammed the snow harder than he intended, and his voice burst out louder than it ever dared to use. "Stop!" The shout echoed across the valley. Soldiers froze. Ishida turned, annoyance rising in his expression. But Haruto rushed past him and drove a stick into the snow ahead. The stick sank through instantly, meeting no resistance. A moment later, the snow collapsed inward, revealing a long, narrow trench beneath, fresh, concealed, perfectly positioned to catch the platoon as they advanced. Gasps rippled through the unit. Some men stepped back instinctively. Others leaned forward, trying to comprehend the sight. Watanabe stared down into the trench with disbelief etched across his tired face. Haruto felt no pride, no sense of triumph. Only confirmation of what his instincts had screamed hours earlier. The Soviets had prepared a trap, but something had interrupted them. The trench was empty now. Supplies removed, blankets left in disarray. They had abandoned the site recently, which meant they were not gone. They had repositioned. Haruto turned slowly, scanning the valley again. The air tasted sharper now. Beneath the stillness, he detected faint movements, vibrations carried to the snowpack, distant but approaching. His neck prickled. The enemy was circling, adjusting their angle, closing off exits. Haruto parted his lips to warn the others, but before he could speak, a single rifle shot cracked across the valley. It came from the far end, cutting through the fog with violent clarity. The platoon tensed immediately, their semi-restored formation dissolving into reflexive chaos. Haruto's breath caught. The Soviets had returned, and they had chosen the perfect moment to strike, just when the platoon was most exposed, gathered around the very trap meant to destroy them. The rifle shot that broke the valley's silence did not echo. It vanished almost at once into the thick fog, as if the mountain swallowed the sound on purpose. The platoon reacted in panic, scattering across the uneven ground, men throwing themselves behind rocks, into shallow dips in the snow, anywhere that seemed to offer even a suggestion of cover. Only moments earlier the valley had felt dead and still. Now every drift of fog looked like a threat, every shape in the whiteness like a figure ready to fire again. Haruto did not scramble like the others. He crouched low and listened, letting the cold wind brush across his cheek. The direction of its push told him everything he needed. The Soviets were not firing from one place. At least two positions, one at the far end of the valley, the other somewhere higher on the western slope. The first shot had not been the beginning of an assault. It had been a test, a probe meant to see how the Japanese soldiers would react before tightening the trap. Ishida yelled for men to form a defensive line, but the command collapsed as soon as it left his lips. A line in an open valley meant exposure. A line meant death. Some soldiers still obeyed out of habit, clustering together behind a fallen tree, rifles shaking violently as they tried to aim. Watanabe dragged two of them away before they got themselves killed. "Spread out. Stay low," he hissed, but the valley was too big, the fog too disorienting, and Ishida's orders only added confusion. Haruto pressed his palm into the snow, not to steady himself, but to feel the vibrations under the ground. It was a strange skill, something his father had taught him during long winters tracking animals. Sound could deceive the ears, vibration seldom lied. And there it was, the faint, rhythmic disturbance of boots moving carefully along the slope. Someone was circling, closing the angle. He looked up and saw a shape flicker through the fog for a brief moment. A Soviet soldier in a white coat, blending almost perfectly with the snow as he moved into position. Watanabe followed Haruto's gaze, then motioned for two nearby riflemen to adjust their aim. Their shots cracked through the cold air, brief flashes cutting through the fog as they forced the Soviet scout to dive for cover. But the enemy responded quickly. Bullets tore into the snow around them, carving thin bursts of white, snapping branches, thudding into rocks. The Japanese formation disintegrated further, men tossing themselves down anywhere they could, breaths fast and shallow. The Soviets were not pushing forward aggressively. They were tightening a noose. Haruto scanned the valley again, heart pounding but mind focused. Staying where they were meant being trapped. Returning toward the ridge they came from meant climbing, under fire. Impossible now. Crossing the valley again was even worse. It would take them straight into the overlapping arcs of Soviet rifles. They had one direction left, and it was the least logical. East, toward a patch of fog that swirled differently from the rest. It wasn't random. The wind moved faster there because the ground dipped, an old stream bed buried under snow. A natural trench. He crawled toward Watanabe, keeping his voice low. There, the wind moves differently. There's a drop in the ground. If we get inside it, they lose sight of us. Watanabe looked and nodded, trusting the boy without hesitation. But as he signaled the first group to move, Ishida noticed and stormed toward them, face flushed with anger. "Sergeant, you do not give orders in my place." Watanabe did not back down. "Sir, if we stay here, we die." Ishida opened his mouth to argue, but a bullet struck the snow beside his boot, spraying ice against his leg. The colonel froze, shaken for the first time. In that moment of hesitation, his authority slipped. He did not agree to the plan, but he did not forbid it, and that was enough. Watanabe waved the men forward. They crawled and slid toward the stream bed as bullets whipped overhead. Haruto led the first group, guiding them with quick gestures around patches of thin snow that had hollow ground. Once inside the narrow depression, the world changed. The Soviet fire, once sharp and clear, now hissed overhead, unable to reach them directly. The soldiers moved in a shaky line, some slipping, others gasping for breath, but all pushing forward with desperate energy. A pair of Soviet soldiers appeared suddenly on a slope to their right, trying to cut off the escape path. Haruto reacted before anyone else, grabbing a stone and hurling it against a rock further up the ridge. The impact sent a burst of snow into the air, drawing the Soviets' attention just long enough for Watanabe's riflemen to fire and force them to take cover. There was no time to celebrate. Haruto urged the group deeper into depression, guiding them around each bend until the valley walls opened enough to give them space behind a cluster of tall boulders. When the last man crawled into shelter, the platoon collapsed in exhaustion. Their breaths came in ragged clouds, hands trembling from fear and cold. The gunfire behind them softened. The Soviets had lost sight of them in the fog. But Haruto knew the silence would not last. The enemy would regroup. They would search the valley systematically. This moment was only a small step out of danger, not an escape. Watanabe leaned beside him, chest rising and falling heavily. "You got us out again," he said. Haruto shook his head. "Only for now. The valley won't hold them long." His gaze rose toward the jagged ridges above them, steep, hostile, and seemingly unpassable. Yet he felt the mountain tug at his instincts again, showing him the faint memory of old goat trails, natural ledges, places where the rock bent inward just enough to form a path no soldier would ever look for. He inhaled deeply. "We're not safe unless we climb," he said quietly. "Up there." Watanabe followed his gaze and paled. "That's almost a cliff." Haruto nodded. "That's why they won't expect us to take it." He felt the cold wind shift again, whispering along the rocks like a warning. The Soviets would not wait long. The mountain offered only one way forward, and it would demand absolute trust from men who barely understood the boy leading them. The shelter behind the boulders felt like borrowed time, nothing more. The fog shifted restlessly through the valley, thinning and thickening in unpredictable waves, each one threatening to expose their position again. The men crouched low, shoulders hunched, breaths steaming like small clouds that vanished almost instantly in the cold. Their faces showed exhaustion deeper than simple fatigue, a quiet, creeping fear that the Soviets were already closing in for the next strike. Even in stillness, they breathed as if expecting bullets at any moment. Haruto stood slightly apart from the group, studying the ridge that loomed above him like a dark wall. To most eyes, it looked impossible, too steep, too brittle, too exposed. But to Haruto, the mountain revealed tiny details, subtle curves in stone, narrow ledges half hidden beneath the snow, changes in wind direction that exposed where the wall dipped inward. He recognized the signs immediately. While goats used paths like these, hunters avoided them because one wrong step meant a fall no one survived. But goats survived them every day. And Haruto, raised on slopes like these, knew how to read their hidden logic. Watanabe joined him, following his gaze with visible skepticism. "That's your route?" he asked. He wasn't mocking the idea, just measuring the risk. Haruto nodded once. "It's the only direction they won't expect. Every other path leads back into their angles." Watanabe exhaled slowly. He knew Haruto was right. The Soviets would sweep the valley soon, advancing from both ends, tightening their net. Staying here was simply a delayed death. Moving forward meant climbing what looked like a vertical mountain face. Behind them, Ishida approached, drawn by necessity more than interest. His pride was damaged. His rank felt smaller than the mountain surrounding them. "You cannot lead men up that wall," he said quietly, not with anger but disbelief. Haruto met his eyes. "They'll follow if they want to live." Ishida's gaze flicked toward the soldiers. Faces pale, legs trembling, hands gripping rifles as if they were lifelines. Survival had already humbled them. Rank no longer mattered. Ishida said nothing more. Haruto stepped toward the ridge and placed his gloved hand on the stone. It was cold, but solid. He lifted himself onto the first narrow ledge, testing its strength with careful pressure. Snow crumbled beneath his boot, but the rock beneath held. He climbed another step, this one more secure, and looked back. "Follow exactly where I step," he said. "If the wind rises, stay close to the wall. Don't lean outward." The first group moved behind him, slow and tense. Private Morita slipped once, scraping his hands, but Watanabe steadied him quickly. Ishida followed further back, silent, struggling to hide the effort it took to climb terrain meant for animals, not soldiers. The mountain forced all of them into the same posture, low, cautious, stripped of any illusion that rank or training offered protection. The initial ascent was the worst. Cold wind striking their backs, loose snow sliding under their boots, fingers numbing as they clung to small outcroppings. Haruto moved steadily, adjusting his path by instinct. When the wind shifted, he paused. When the snow layer thinned, he altered direction slightly. The men trusted him without question now, copying each movement with absolute precision. In any other moment of the war, Haruto would have been dismissed as an untrained auxiliary. In this moment, he was the only reason they were still alive. Halfway up, the ridge curved sharply to the right, revealing a narrow shelf running just beneath a jagged overhang. The shelf was barely wide enough for one person at a time, but its stone was more stable than the loose snow behind them. Haruto traversed it carefully, pressing his shoulder against the rock. The others followed, moving in slow, silent sequence. At one point the wind surged, carrying a blast of snow sideways. Watanabe shouted for men to hold on, and several pressed themselves flat against the wall. Haruto waited until the wind eased, then signaled them onward. When they finally reached the upper crest, the world opened suddenly. The valley below disappeared into a shifting white haze, while ahead lay a long stretch of untouched mountain terrain, harsh, but free of enemy presence. The men collapsed onto the snow, gasping, shaking, overwhelmed by the simple fact of having survived the impossible ascent. Haruto remained standing for a moment, scanning the ridge behind them. The fog churned below, hiding the Soviets who would soon realize their prey had vanished. The climb had bought time, but not safety. The mountain path ahead would be harder, and their supplies were dwindling. Still, for the first time since the ambush, the platoon had a direction that was not dictated by fear or confusion. It was dictated by the mountain, and by the boy who understood it better than any officer. Watanabe stepped beside Haruto, placing a gloved hand on the boy's shoulder. "Lead on," he said quietly. "We follow you now." Haruto felt the weight of those words settle over him. Not heavy like a burden, but solid like responsibility finally acknowledged. He nodded, watching the snow swirl across the ridge, already reading the next turn in the wind. The mountain had given them one path. Now he had to guide them across every step of it. The ridge offered space, but not rest. The men recovered only enough breath to stay conscious. They were too cold, too hungry, and too aware of how narrow their escape had been. Snow drifted constantly across the crest, sometimes blowing in thin sheets, sometimes swirling in frantic circles that stung their faces and coated their uniforms with a fresh layer of frost. Below them, the valley was a churning sea of fog, hiding the Soviets who would soon be on the move again. The silence up here felt different, not peaceful, but alert, as if the mountain itself listened. Haruto knelt at the ridge's edge, studying the terrain ahead. The next stretch of mountain curved into a long slope broken by ridges and pockets of thick pine. At a distance, the path looked safe enough, but Haruto spotted subtle variations in the snowfall, irregular patches, slight dips, Faint distortions in the wind that suggested unstable ground. Deep snow could hide loose shale or sudden drops. Worse, the clouds above were gathering weight, thickening with the promise of another storm. The Soviet pursuers would not be slowed by weather. They were used to harsh conditions and would push upward as soon as they identified the route the Japanese had taken. Watanabe approached slowly, his breath still uneven from the climb. "Talk to me," he said. "What are we facing?" Haruto pointed toward a long, slanted section where the snow seemed unnaturally smooth. "There's a slide area there. If someone steps wrong, the whole layer could collapse." He shifted his hand toward a cluster of rocks jutting out from a ridge. "We need to cross behind those. The wind breaks differently there. Safer footing." Watanabe nodded, trusting the explanation even if the reasoning was foreign to him. Ishida lingered behind the group, pretending to inspect the surroundings, but clearly watching Haruto more than the mountain. The colonel's pride still smoldered, but there was something else in his expression now. Frustration that the fate of his unit rested in the hands of a boy he had dismissed as insignificant. The march resumed slowly. The men moved in a tight line behind Haruto, following his steps exactly as he tested the snow ahead with short, cautious probes of his boot. The wind changed direction every few minutes, forcing Haruto to pause and adjust their route. He scanned constantly for signs others would never notice. The direction of a snowflake's fall, the faint odor of sap carried by the wind, the muffled creak of shifting layers beneath the surface. At one point, he stopped abruptly and signaled for silence. The men froze, breath hanging in small puffs. Haruto closed his eyes for a moment, listening. There was the distant crack of ice breaking somewhere behind them. Not natural. The Soviets were climbing too, but they were far enough to not yet see the ridge trail clearly. The crack would have been a misstep on thin frost, someone too heavy-footed for the terrain. Haruto gestured for the group to move faster, but quietly. Watanabe passed the word along. Even Ishida, swallowing his instinct to command, complied. Hours passed in an exhausting combination of tension, cold, and constant movement. The slope grew steeper, forcing the men to brace themselves with both hands on the snow as they advanced. Haruto guided them around dangerous sections where the snow sounded hollow beneath his weight. When the path narrowed between two tall outcrops, he crawled first to check for stability, waving the others through only when he was certain the rock beneath was safe. The men followed without a word, too tired to speak, too afraid to question. Eventually the slope widened again, revealing a stretch of forest. Tall pines bent under the weight of heavy snow. The air smelled different here, sharper, with a hint of resin. Haruto exhaled in relief. Trees meant shelter from wind, and at least some protection from visibility. "We stop inside the trees," he said, and Watanabe relayed the order. Ishida made no objection. The mountain had stripped him of the illusion of control. When they reached the thicker part of the forest, the men dropped to the ground beneath low branches, their bodies trembling from cold and exhaustion. The snow was softer here, quiet, almost gentle. Haruto went to the edge of the tree line and studied the tracks they had left behind. They were too clear. Anyone following would find them easily. He scanned the slope again and noticed a narrow rise to the right, where snow drifted downward from a rocky overhang. The falling snow created natural distortions. If they moved through that channel, the wind would cover their tracks. He walked back to Watanabe. "We'll need to move again before night," he said. "This snow won't hide us for long." Watanabe rubbed his forehead. "The men can barely stand." "They'll die if we stay," Haruto said simply. There was no cruelty in his tone, only honesty shaped by the mountain's logic. Watanabe nodded, unwilling but accepting. Ishida listened from a distance. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Whatever protests he might have voiced earlier in the campaign had been erased by the surviving evidence of Haruto's instincts. Before they moved again, Haruto stood alone for a moment, looking upward toward the clouds pressing against the mountain peaks. A storm brewed there, heavy, fast, and dangerous. He felt the shift in air pressure, the subtle sting of fine snow on his cheek. The storm would turn the mountain into a killing ground, but it would also erase tracks, distort sound, and create confusion. If they used it correctly, it could be an ally. He closed his eyes briefly, remembering the day his father died, the crack of snow, the roar of the avalanche. He had misread the mountain then. He would not misread it now. He opened his eyes. "The storm is coming," he said quietly. "We move before it does. And when it hits, we climb." The storm struck the ridge with a force that felt almost deliberate, as if the mountain had waited for the moment the men were most exposed. Snow drove across the slope in violent sheets, blinding them within seconds and turning every familiar shape into shifting white. Haruto led the formation as best he could, leaning into the wind while the others struggled to keep his silhouette in sight. The storm erased depth, distance, and sound. It muffled the world so completely that even the distant report of Soviet rifles became swallowed before reaching them. Haruto knew the pursuers were somewhere below, trying to guess their route. But the storm now served as a barrier. The Soviets could not track what they could not see. Movement grew harder with every step. The snow rose past their ankles, then their shins, forcing the men to lift their legs high just to continue. Watanabe kept checking the line behind them, making sure no one was falling too far back. Ishida marched in silence, his authority buried under exhaustion and the raw reality that the mountain listened to Haruto, not him. Visibility shrank to a few meters, but Haruto pressed forward, testing the ground before each step. He felt the difference in weight under the snow, the softness that warned of hollow pockets, the sharp vibration that betrayed hidden ice. The others did not understand how he sensed these things, but they followed because survival depended on that instinct. The slope steepened. One soldier slipped and slid several meters before Watanabe caught him by the collar. Panic spread briefly through the group, but Haruto signaled them to stay low and continue. Stopping meant freezing in place. Stopping meant giving the Soviets time to close distance. He guided them toward a narrow ledge he barely recognized through the storm. Beneath the powdery snow, the stone felt stable, and Haruto crossed it slowly, pressing his shoulder against the rock. The men followed one by one, stepping exactly where he stepped, gripping whatever outcroppings or numb fingers could find. When they reached a wider section, Haruto paused. A tremor shook the ground, soft, almost easy to ignore but unmistakable to him. He stared upward through the swirling snow and saw the faint, shifting movement of a heavy layer of snow beginning to detach. It had not broken yet, but the slope above them was unstable. If they kept moving straight, the next disturbance could send an avalanche down the path. He turned sharply toward Watanabe. "We need to move left. The snow above is breaking." Watanabe did not question him, but Ishida stepped forward, trying to reassert control. "The ridge continues upward. Left takes us toward a dead end," he said, voice wavering. Haruto shook his head. "If we continue straight, the snow will fall on us." Ishida stood rigid, torn between pride and fear. Before he could speak again, another tremor shivered through the slope. Even he felt it. Watanabe spoke firmly. "We follow Haruto." Ishida hesitated, then stepped back, unable to argue against the mountain itself. Haruto led them toward a line of rocks where the snowpack was thinner. The group moved as quickly as the wind allowed, bending low against gusts that nearly shoved them off their feet. Just as the last man crossed behind the rocks, a deep crack echoed across the slope. The entire layer of snow above gave way. It collapsed in a heavy roar, sliding down the path they had nearly taken, erasing it completely beneath a massive wave of white. The men stared in stunned silence, each one realizing how close they had come to being buried. Haruto didn't pause long. He looked upward, where the storm churned against the final ascent. The ridge above was steep, but passable. It was their last barrier before reaching the sheltered upper plateau beyond Soviet reach. "We keep moving," he said, voice steady despite the wind. "The worst is behind us, but the climb is not finished." The men gathered themselves, gripping rifles and straps with renewed determination. The storm whipped around them, relentless but now survivable. They followed Haruto once more, the only guide who could read the mountain's shifting heart, climbing toward the final stretch that would decide whether any of them lived to see another dawn. The last ascent was the steepest of all, a long incline of snow-laden stone that rose like a frozen wall into the storm. Haruto moved first, carving a path with slow, careful steps. The wind tore sideways across the slope, strong enough to push a man off balance if he leaned even slightly the wrong way. The air thinned as they climbed, burning their lungs with every breath. Yet Haruto kept going, guiding the unit upward through the blinding white, adjusting direction whenever the snow beneath his boots shifted in density. Watanabe stayed close behind him, counting each man as if afraid the storm might swallow someone between one heartbeat and the next. Halfway up, the storm changed character. The wind eased for a moment, settling into a heavy stillness that pressed against their ears. Haruto felt the shift immediately. This wasn't calm. It was the weight of snow clinging to the mountain, waiting for movement to disturb it. He slowed the group, forcing them to stay low, spreading their weight across the surface. Ishida, exhausted and barely able to lift his legs, said nothing now. Whatever resistance he once held had dissolved into raw survival. Every man followed Haruto's gestures without hesitation, moving with the unity of people who understood that one mistake could bring the mountain down on all of them. The final stretch angled sharply to the right, toward a ridge that disappeared into dense fog. Haruto recognized the pattern of the wind cutting across that ridge, the same pattern he had seen days earlier when tracking wild goats with his father. It meant there was a break in stone, a natural passage that curved upward and out of the storm's immediate path. He guided the platoon toward it, testing the snow every few steps. The ground held. They pushed forward, inch by inch, until at last the slope softened beneath their boots. The wind dropped behind them like a door closing. Haruto climbed the final meter and emerged onto a wide crest of stone and snow. The air felt different here, colder but open. No cliffs loomed overhead. No unstable layers pressed from above. The storm continued behind them, roaring against the slope they had ascended, but the ridge itself remained sheltered, almost quiet. Haruto stepped aside to let the men climb up after him. One by one they appeared over the top, collapsing onto the snow with exhaustion and disbelief. Some laughed weakly. Others cried into their sleeves, unable to hide the emotional weight of the last hours. Watanabe placed both hands on his knees, bent forward, and let out a long, shaking breath. Ishida sank to the ground without a word, staring blankly at the storm below as if trying to understand how the world had changed without his permission. Haruto did not collapse. He walked to the edge of the ridge and looked down into the swirling whiteness, watching the storm bury their old tracks. The Soviets would never follow them now. Even if they reached the upper slopes, they would find only a blank wall of fresh snow and the destroyed path of the avalanche that had nearly taken them. The mountain itself had covered their escape, wiping away every sign of their route. The men slowly gathered around Haruto, though none of them spoke at first. There was nothing to say. They all understood why they were alive. They had seen it with their own eyes. The boy who had walked ahead through every danger, reading the mountain as if it whispered directly into his ear. Watanabe finally stepped closer, his expression carrying a quiet respect far deeper than words. "If you hadn't been with us," he began, but Haruto shook his head before the sentence could finish. He didn't need the acknowledgement. The mountain didn't give praise, and he didn't expect it from men. Still, Watanabe put a hand on his shoulder. "You saved us," he said simply. An hour later, when the storm weakened enough for them to continue, they moved along the ridge until the landscape opened into the higher plateau, wide, wind-scoured, and empty of Soviet presence. It would lead them back toward the distant Japanese lines. Not safety, not comfort, but a chance. And in war, a chance was everything. As the men set up a temporary shelter among scattered rocks, Haruto drifted a few steps away, standing alone on the crest where the wind lifted thin strands of snow into the air. He looked outward at the mountains stretching in every direction, peaks rising and falling like frozen waves under the gray winter sky. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to breathe deeply. He thought of his father, of the avalanche he had failed to foresee, of the guilt he had carried ever since. The memory no longer felt like a weight crushing his chest. Instead, it felt like a lesson he had finally understood. The mountain could not be controlled. It could only be read, respected, listened to, and for the first time, Haruto felt it had honored that teaching fully, not by saving himself, but by guiding others of the storm that could have buried them. Snow drifted across the crest in gentle spirals, moving almost like a gesture of quiet acknowledgement. Haruto watched it for a long moment, then stepped back toward the soldiers who waited without saying they waited, who followed without saying they followed. They owed him their lives, though he did not claim them. His place was not in glory or command. His place was here, in the cold air, reading what others could not see. The mountain accepted him, and he accepted its truth. Invisible knowledge, quiet courage, and the voice of a land that only spoke to those willing to listen. These had carried an entire platoon to safety. And as Haruto walked back toward the men, the wind shifted softly across the ridge, as if offering a final, silent affirmation.